Augusta Calthorpe heard the words through a door that had not closed properly. And she did not move. She sat at a dinner table set for two. A white soup cooling in a bowl before her, candlelight steady on silver she had polished by instruction for 23 years. And she heard her husband discuss the date on which she would be taken away. His voice was low and pleasant, the voice he used with tradesmen and doctors and men he intended to manage. The doctor's voice was lower still, accommodating, the voice of a man being paid to agree. Augusta heard the phrase, increasing nervous symptoms, and recognized it as a description of a woman she had never met. She heard the phrase, commitment certificate, and understood. With a clarity that arrived not as shock, but as the final piece of a picture she had been looking at for 2 decades without seeing the frame, that her husband had finished deciding something. She picked up her soup spoon. When Roderick returned to the table 5 minutes later, smoothing his coat, offering some pleasantry about Pell's tiresome habit of calling without notice, Augusta was smiling. She asked whether he would like more claret. He said he would. She poured it herself. That was the last ordinary evening at Halnaby House. Sir Roderick Calthorpe, Viscount Halnaby, was 51 years old and had been, for the whole of Augusta's adult life, the primary fact of her existence. She had married him at 24, the year after her first betrothed died of a fever that took him in a week, leaving her stunned and grateful for the arrangement her father pressed forward before grief could make her inconvenient. Roderick had been handsome then, or at least capable of appearing so in candlelight, and he had wanted her fortune more than he had wanted her, a distinction she had not understood at 24 and had spent 23 years learning to name. The £18,000 of her separate trust, settled by her father's will in terms that required Roderick's management only in the event of her incapacity, had been the unspoken subject of every significant conversation in their marriage. Augusta had known this for years. What she had not known, until the soup course of an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, was that her husband had moved from wanting the money to arranging for the legal instrument that would deliver it. There had been one child, a boy, born too early in the 3rd year of the marriage, who had not breathed. She had not spoken of it since the week it happened. She had put on black for 6 months and then put on other colors and continued. That night, after Roderick had gone to his rooms, Augusta sat at her writing desk in the small sitting room she had claimed at the beginning of the marriage as a place he did not enter. And she worked. She drew a single sheet of paper toward her and wrote, in 2 columns, every person she knew of moderate influence or legal standing. The left column she headed independent. The right column she headed his. By 1 in the morning, the right column was full, and the left column contained 4 names. By 2 in the morning, she had eliminated 3 of those. 1 dead, 1 abroad, 1 connected by marriage to Roderick's club. The 4th name she had found, not through her own acquaintance, but through an obituary in a 3-year-old gazette she had kept for an unrelated reason. A notice for a Mrs. Dorothea Crane, late of Gray's Inn, whose affairs had been settled by Mr. Theophilus Marsden, solicitor, of the same address. What had caught her attention 3 years ago was a phrase in the obituary's legal notice: specialist in contested settlements and separations, that had made her fold the paper and put it in her desk without quite knowing why. She knew why now. She wrote the name on a separate piece of paper and folded it. Then she wrote a second piece of paper, a short list, 2 items only, headed next. The first item was Marsden. The second item was Linnet Vaughan. Augusta had known about Linnet Vaughan for 14 months. She had not known her name for the first 6 of those months. She had known only that Roderick was spending Wednesday evenings away from the house with an implausibility of excuse that suggested either a mistress or a debt, and that the quality of his linen on those evenings was better than his usual. She had found the name through the simple method of asking her lady's maid, who had asked the footman, who had heard it from the coachman. Linnet Vaughn, 29, Bloomsbury, the daughter of a linen draper who had died solvent and left her a house and a modest income. Augusta had done nothing with this information for 8 months. She had told herself there was nothing useful to be done with it. She had been wrong. She saw that now, clearly and without self-recrimination, because self-recrimination was a luxury she could not afford at 2 in the morning with a commitment certificate already drafted and a doctor already paid. She blew out the candle and went to bed and slept 4 hours without difficulty, which surprised her until she understood that the difficulty of the last 20 years had been the not knowing, and that was finished. 8 days later, Augusta stepped down from a hired carriage in Bloomsbury and presented her card at a narrow terraced house with a blue door and a window box of late autumn herbs. The maid who answered looked at the card, looked at Augusta, and withdrew without speaking. Augusta waited in the hall, which was clean and simply furnished and smelled of beeswax and something herbal she could not identify. She waited 4 minutes. Then a door opened. Linnet Vaughn was not what Augusta had imagined, though she could not afterwards say precisely what she had imagined. She was slight, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been pretty at 20 and was becoming something more interesting at 29. Sharper about the eyes, more deliberate in its expressions. She stood in the parlor doorway and looked at Augusta with an attention that was neither hostile nor deferential, and Augusta recognized it immediately as the look of a woman who had spent years deciding quickly which category a new person fell into. "Lady Halnaby," Linnet said. She did not move from the doorway. "Miss Vaughn," Augusta replied, "I would be grateful for half an hour of your time. I have not come to reproach you. I have come because I need your help. And I believe you may find, when you hear me, that you need mine." Linnet stepped back from the doorway and gestured toward the chairs by the fire. They sat. Linnet did not offer tea immediately, which Augusta noted as a form of honesty. The woman was not going to perform hospitality until she knew what she was hosting. Augusta approved of this. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke plainly. "My husband is preparing to have me declared of unsound mind and committed to a private establishment," Augusta said. "He has engaged Dr. Pell of Harley Street, who has been paid, I believe, to provide the necessary certificate. The purpose is my £18,000 trust, which transfers to my husband's management upon my legal incapacity. I overheard the conversation between my husband and Dr. Pell 11 days ago. I have since engaged a solicitor, and I am in the process of building a case. What I require from you is a written deposition of any conversation you have heard my husband conduct regarding myself, my health, or his financial affairs, conversations he held when he believed no wife was listening." Linnet had not moved during this speech. Now she said, "You are not what he described." "No," Augusta said. "I rarely am." A pause settled between them. The fire shifted. Linnet looked at the grate, then back at Augusta, and Augusta saw the precise moment when the woman's calculation resolved into something else. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of recognition. "He told me you were fragile," Linnet said, "that you had been unwell for years, that you misunderstood things, that a separation would distress you beyond what you could manage." She paused. "He said it with great concern." "He has been practicing that concern for some time," Augusta said. "I thought—" Linnet stopped. She began again. I told myself it was a private matter between a husband and wife. I told myself I had no standing to form an opinion. You have standing now, Augusta said. He used you to build a picture of a sick woman. Every conversation you had with him in which he described my condition is evidence of premeditation. You are not an accessory to anything he has done, but you are a witness to it, and I am asking whether you are willing to say so. The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Lynette looked at her hands, then at Augusta, then at the window where the afternoon light was fading over the rooftops of Bloomsbury. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, quieter, and with something in it that Augusta thought might be relief. He does not love me, Lynette said. I have known that for some time. I told myself it did not matter. She paused. It turns out it mattered a great deal. Then we are both women who told ourselves something that was not true, Augusta said. And we are both, as of this afternoon, finished with that. The tea arrived. They drank it. The conversation ran another hour and 40 minutes. And by the end of it, Augusta had what she had come for, Lynette's agreement to provide a full written deposition. And something she had not expected, which was the beginning of a respect for this woman that had nothing to do with the circumstances that had brought them to the same parlor. The following afternoon, Augusta called at Gray's Inn. Theophilus Marsden's chambers were on the second floor of a building that smelled of old paper and coal smoke, and he received her in a room lined with case files that had been organized with a precision she found immediately reassuring. He was a tall man, lean and slightly angular, with gray beginning at his temples and a stillness about him that suggested he had long ago stopped using movement to fill silence. He read her initial letter of instruction, which she had sent the previous day, then set it down and looked at her across the desk. You understand, he said, that a petition for separation on the grounds of fraud and conspiracy to commit will require evidence of a standard that most London firms would decline to pursue against a Viscount. I understand that, Augusta said. That is why I am not at a London firm. I am here. He considered this. I should tell you what the case will cost me if it proceeds, he said. My daughter is recently betrothed to a young man whose family moves in your husband's circle. If I take this case publicly, that connection becomes untenable. My standing in the inns has been built on 25 years of careful practice. Cases that were right, but not costly. This case is different. I may lose clients. I may lose the inns entirely if the opposition moves against me. Augusta looked at him steadily. And? He answered without hesitation. And I will take it, Theophilus said. I want you to know the cost, because I am not taking it without knowing it myself. But I have been doing small versions of this work for 25 years. And I think the reason I have been doing small versions is that I was waiting to be capable of the real demand when it arrived. He picked up his pen. It has arrived. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Augusta told him. She spoke for 2 hours without notes, and he wrote without interrupting. And by the time she finished, the room was dark, and he had lit the lamp on the desk, and the fire had been built up twice by a clerk who moved quietly and asked no questions. You will not return to Halnaby House, Theophilus said when she finished. No, Augusta agreed. Where will you stay? I have identified a hotel in Marylebone. My husband does not go to Marylebone. She paused. I will write him a letter this evening telling him I am visiting my cousin in Kent. He will believe it for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. He thinks I have no reason to run. He is not accustomed to women who make lists, Theophilus said, and something in his tone was not quite dry and not quite warm and was entirely, she thought, the voice of a man who meant what he said. She moved to the hotel that week. She wrote Roderick a pleasant letter about Kent. She slept, for the first time in 11 days, without waking before dawn. The work began in earnest in the first week of December. Augusta, Linnet, and Theophilus met on Tuesdays and Fridays in the Gray's Inn chambers, seated around the central table with the case files arranged between them. The first order of business was Linnet's deposition. 14 pages of handwritten testimony covering 9 months of conversations, dates, and locations, noted with a precision that surprised Theophilus and did not surprise Augusta, who had recognized from the first afternoon that Linnet Vaughan's mind worked in columns as naturally as her own. The deposition contained, among other things, 3 separate occasions on which Roderick had described Augusta's health to Linnet in terms that directly corresponded to the language used in the draft commitment certificate, language that, Theophilus pointed out, was too specific to be coincidental. It contained a reference to Dr. Pell by name in a conversation that had taken place 8 months before Augusta overheard the study conversation, establishing premeditation. And it contained a passage in which Roderick had discussed, in terms he clearly considered private, the precise mechanism by which Augusta's trust would transfer to his management upon her incapacity. A passage Linnet had recorded word for word because, she told them, something in the specificity of it had made her uneasy in a way she had not understood at the time. "You wrote it down the same night?" Theophilus asked. "The same night," Linnet confirmed. "I did not know why. I only knew I wanted to have it." The bank records came next. Theophilus had a contact at the institution through which Dr. Pell conducted his practice accounts, and through a process Augusta did not ask him to detail, he obtained a record of 3 payments made over 6 months, substantial, regular, and entered in the ledger under a description that was almost insultingly vague. The payments corresponded precisely to the dates on which the commitment certificate's preliminary paperwork had been drafted. The certificate itself arrived in the 3rd week, delivered by a clerk named Hobson who had worked in Dr. Pell's office for 7 years and who appeared in Theophilus's chambers one Tuesday afternoon with an envelope inside his coat and an expression of a man who had been waiting to do something and was relieved to finally do it. He set the envelope on the table, accepted a cup of tea, and told them that Theophilus had helped his mother secure her widow's pension 4 years ago when the pension office had refused her claim on a technicality, and that he had been looking for the opportunity to be useful ever since. The unsigned commitment certificate named Augusta by title and described, in the careful language of medical authority, a woman given to irrational fears, disordered speech, and an inability to manage her own affairs. A description so remote from the woman who sat reading it across the table that Augusta set it down after the first paragraph and looked at the wall for a moment before picking it up again. It was in that 3rd week, on a Friday afternoon when the light had gone early and the chambers were lit by lamplight, that Augusta's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her gloves at the end of the session. She was not aware of it until she noticed that a small glass of brandy had appeared on the table within her reach, placed there without comment, without announcement, while Theophilus was reviewing a file and had apparently not looked up. She looked at the glass, then at him. He was still reading. She had mentioned in a conversation 2 days earlier that brandy steadied her hands when they were unsteady from fatigue. It had been a passing remark, incidental, offered in the context of something else entirely. She had not expected it to be remembered. She drank the brandy. She put on her gloves. She said good evening and left. On the stairs she stopped for a moment and stood very still with her hand on the banister. And then she continued down, over those weeks. The formality between Augusta and Linnet had been dissolving in the way that formality does when 2 people are engaged in something real. not through any particular declaration or confidence, but through the accumulation of small moments. A look exchanged when Theophilus made a dry observation, a shared impatience with a particular form of legal language that required the same clause to be stated 4 times in succession. The afternoon Linnet arrived with her hair not quite right because she had walked fast in the wind and had not stopped to correct it, and Augusta did not mention it, and Linnet noticed that she had not mentioned it and said, without looking up from the file she was reading, "Thank you." By the 5th week, they were taking tea alone together in the small room off the chambers, without any legal pretext for the meeting, simply because the work had made them people who had things to say to each other. It was Linnet who found the thread that changed the shape of everything. She had been following a rumor, the kind of rumor that exists at the edges of social circles, never quite spoken directly, referred to in the past tense and in low voices. A woman in Bristol, 3 years earlier, a husband of good standing, a doctor. Linnet had heard the edge of it from a woman she knew socially, and had pressed carefully until she had a name, Mrs. Mary Holloway, and a location, which was not Bristol at all, but a private asylum in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Linnet traveled alone, telling neither Augusta nor Theophilus until she had something definite to bring back. She was gone 4 days. When she returned to the chambers on a Thursday morning, she set her coat and hat on the chair by the door with a deliberateness that made both Augusta and Theophilus look up. And she sat down at the table and placed before them a folded document with a witness seal. "Her name is Mary Holloway," Linnet said. "She is 34 years old. She was committed to the Halford private establishment in November of 1852, certified by Dr. Pell of Harley Street as suffering from melancholic delusions and an inability to manage her own affairs. She has been there for 2 years and 7 months. She is entirely lucid. She knew who I was within 5 minutes of our first conversation, and asked, in the second conversation, whether I had brought a copy of the Lunacy Act with me, because she had been trying to obtain one for 18 months. Linnet paused. "Her husband's name is Mr. Gerald Holloway. He is a business associate of your husband's from the Bristol days. And her separate property, which was settled on her by her father's will, transferred to her husband's management, in full upon her certification." The room was very quiet. Augusta did not move. Theophilus set down his pen. "The same doctor," he said. "The same doctor," Linnet confirmed. "The same language in the certificate. I compared it with ours. The same payments in the same bank, though I had to work harder for those. And the same pattern. A wife with a separate trust, a husband who wanted access to it, a doctor who could be engaged to provide the mechanism." She unfolded the document. "This is Mary Holloway's deposition, witnessed by the asylum's own chaplain, who agreed to witness it because he has been troubled by her case for 2 years and had no legal avenue available to him until I provided one." She began to read. Her voice was steady and clear, and she read every word, and the words described 2 years and 7 months of a lucid woman inside walls she had not chosen, writing letters that were not sent, requesting legal counsel that was not provided, asking questions that were answered with sedatives. Augusta listened without moving. When Linnet finished, she placed the document on the table and folded her hands on top of it. Theophilus stood and went to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to them, looking out at the gray December courtyard of Gray's Inn. Then he turned around. "This is no longer a petition for separation," he said. "It is a criminal conspiracy, and it has been running for at least 3 years, and it involves at minimum 2 husbands, 1 doctor, and a pattern of conduct that the College of Physicians will not be able to ignore when it is placed before them with documentation." He came back to the table and sat down. I need to tell you both what this means for the strategy, and I am not going to soften it. We cannot move on the separation alone. We must file simultaneously on 4 fronts: the separation petition, which we already have; a habeas corpus application for Mrs. Holloway, which I will draft this week; a criminal complaint naming Pell, your husband, and Holloway for conspiracy to defraud; and a formal complaint to the College of Physicians requesting Pell's suspension pending inquiry. We file all 4 on the same day, before your husband can reach Pell and have him alter records. If we move on one without the others, one without, Roderick will have time to manage the story. When? Augusta asked. 6 weeks, Theophilus said. Possibly 5. I need to draft the habeas application and the criminal complaint from scratch, and both must be airtight before they are filed. The separation petition is nearly complete. The college complaint will take me a day. He looked at her directly. It will be a great deal of work. I am aware of that, Augusta said. I have not finished, he said. Mrs. Holloway must be freed before the dinner. Augusta looked at him. What dinner? Your husband sent you a birthday dinner invitation 2 months ago, Theophilus said. Your place is still set at his table. You are going to accept it. The quiet that settled then was of a different kind than any that had come before it. Augusta looked at the document on the table, then at Theophilus, and understood what he was proposing. You want to use the dinner, she said. I want you to use the dinner, he said. It is your dinner. It is your house. It is your marriage he attempted to destroy, and your name he intended to commit to an asylum, and your trust he was prepared to steal. The dinner is where you end it, in front of every person in that room who will spend the rest of their lives knowing what they witnessed. He paused. If you want it to end that way. Augusta looked at Lynette, who was watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained the possibility of one. Yes, Augusta said. That is exactly how I want it to end. The Bristol discovery doubled the work, and the work was already considerable. Theophilus drafted the habeas corpus application and the criminal complaint simultaneously, working across a desk that was never clear of paper, while Augusta cross-checked every date in Pell's records against her own household accounts. A task that required her to sit with 5 years of domestic ledgers and trace, entry by entry, the pattern of Roderick's expenditures in the months surrounding each of the doctor's visits. The pattern, when it emerged, was exact. The 10th week was the hardest. It was a night in mid-January, the kind of cold that made the streets outside the hotel feel like another country. And Augusta sat in her room with a candle and a copy of the draft habeas petition and worked a calculation she had been avoiding. She took the date of the study conversation, the date the commitment certificate had been drafted, the rate at which such proceedings typically moved, and she arrived at an answer. 18 months, perhaps 20. That was how long she had had. That was how close she had come to being Mary Holloway. She sat with that for a while. Then she put on her coat. She arrived at the chambers at 11:15. The building was dark except for the light in Theophilus's window. His clerk, Sims, was still at the outer desk and let her in without surprise, which told her this was not an unusual hour for the work to continue. She went through to the inner room. Theophilus looked up from the petition draft. He took in her coat, her face, and the hour, and said only, "Sit down," gesturing to the small sofa by the fire. "I came to verify the clause about the certification date," she said. "Paragraph 4 of the habeas application." "I know which clause you mean," he said. "It is correct. I checked it this afternoon." He did not look back at the petition. "Sit down, Augusta." It was the first time he had used her given name. She sat down on the sofa by the fire. He came to sit beside her, not immediately, but after a moment, as though giving her the choice of whether she wanted company or solitude, and she did not move away. The fire was low and steady. She looked at it for a while. "I calculated tonight how long I had before it would have been completed," she said. "Before the certificate would have been served and the proceedings begun." 18 months, Theophilus said. "I made the same calculation in October." "I would have been Mary?" she said. "Yes," he said. He did not offer her a different version of that truth, and she was grateful for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a child in the 3rd year of the marriage, a boy. He was born too early and did not breathe. I was alone in the room when it happened. The midwife had stepped out and my husband was not there. I have never wept aloud with another person in the room. I wept then, but I was alone." She paused. "I have never told anyone that before. I am not certain why I am telling you now." He did not speak immediately. He listened, which she had noticed from the first afternoon was something he did with his whole attention, not the partial attention most people offered while constructing their response. When she finished, he shifted slightly on the sofa and took her hand in both of his. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, simply a hold, steady and warm, the weight of both his hands around hers. They stayed that way while the fire burned down to coals. Augusta did not speak again, and neither did he. And the quiet between them was not uncomfortable, but restful in a way she had not experienced since before she could remember. When the room had grown cold, she rose, and he rose with her. And she put on her coat, and he held it for her. And she said good night and went out into the January dark and walked back to the hotel with her hands in her muff and her mind, for the first time in weeks, entirely still. He had not moved from beside the fire when she left. She knew this because she had turned once at the door, and he was still sitting with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the coals. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the chambers from the family of Theophilus's daughter's fiancé. The letter was courteous and specific. Rumors had reached their circle regarding Mr. Marsden's current case and its subject, and the family felt it necessary to inquire whether the engagement might be reconsidered. Theophilus read the letter at his desk, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and went home to his house in Islington that evening, where his daughter Clara was at supper. He sat down across from her and told her everything: the case, the petition, the conspiracy, what it would cost him, what it had already cost him, and what the letter in his pocket contained. Clara was 24 and had her father's habit of listening without interruption. She heard him to the end. Then she was quiet for a long moment, and Theophilus watched her face and did not try to fill the silence. "I would not marry a man whose family required you to be smaller than you are," Clara said at last. "That is not a man I want." She picked up her fork. "Write them back in the morning. I will manage the rest." The engagement ended at her initiation the following week. The fiancé, to his credit, was more distressed than his family. The situation on Roderick's side had been shifting since the new year. He had sent a manservant to the Kent address Augusta had named in her letter, and the manservant had found no cousin and no Augusta, and had reported this back with the particular embarrassment of a man who has been sent to find something that is not there. Roderick had then begun asking, in the careful way of a man who does not wish to appear to be asking, where his wife was. His aunt, Lady Branscombe, a formidable woman in her early 70s, who had strong opinions about the proper conduct of marriages and the improper conduct of wives, called at the Gray's Inn Chambers one Thursday afternoon and was received by Theophilus in the outer room. "I am inquiring on behalf of my nephew, Sir Roderick Calthorpe, as to the whereabouts of Lady Halnaby and the nature of any professional engagement you may have undertaken on her behalf," Lady Branscombe said. She delivered this with the authority of a woman accustomed to receiving answers. "The matter is privileged, Lady Branscombe," Theophilus said pleasantly. "I am not at liberty to discuss it. May I show you out?" Lady Branscombe looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating. "You are aware," she said, "that my nephew has considerable influence in legal circles." "I am aware of a great many things," Theophilus said, and opened the door. The story had begun to circulate in drawing rooms by the end of January, distorted, incomplete, but spreading in the particular way that London stories spread when they involve a viscount and an absent wife and a solicitor of no social standing whatsoever. Roderick's version, Augusta gathered from Theophilus's reports, involved a wife in the grip of a nervous crisis who had been taken advantage of by an unscrupulous lawyer. It was, she noted, a version that required her to be exactly what the commitment certificate said she was. In week 8, on a gray February afternoon, Theophilus read Mary Holloway's Yorkshire deposition aloud into the formal record. The full document, every word, for the purpose of the criminal complaint. Augusta sat across the desk and listened to the chaplain's witness testimony describing Mary's condition, her clarity, her requests, her letters that were not sent. By the time Theophilus reached the final page, Augusta's hands were closed on the arms of the chair, the knuckles pale. Theophilus finished reading. He set the document down. He reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers, not the gentle, tentative gesture of someone uncertain of their welcome, but a firm, deliberate weight, a hand that said he was present and would not withdraw. He held it there for a long minute. Augusta looked at his hand on hers, and then she turned her hand under his and pressed it once, and he felt it and did not move, and neither did she. And the fire in the grate went on burning, and the February light went on fading through the windows of Gray's Inn. And that was the first touch either of them had chosen. They filed on a Thursday in the second week of February. Theophilus had been at the desk for 40 hours across 2 days. The petition spread across every surface of the chambers, Sims bringing coffee at intervals and carrying documents to the relevant offices as each section was completed. Augusta and Linnet arrived at 7 in the morning and worked beside him. Augusta reviewing dates and figures, Linnet organizing the supporting documents into the sequence Theophilus had specified. At 10:30, the final packet was sealed. At noon, Sims carried it to the court. Augusta wrote her acceptance of Roderick's birthday dinner invitation that afternoon and sent it by the evening post. The habeas corpus action for Mary Holloway was heard 3 days before the dinner. The judge, presented with Mary's deposition, the chaplain's testimony, and the bank records showing Pell's payments, granted the writ within the hour. Mary Holloway walked out of the Halford private establishment on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by Linnet and a hired carriage, and was installed in a cottage outside London with her sister, who had been trying to reach her for 2 years. Mary was small and thin and moved carefully, as people do when they have spent a long time in spaces where movement was restricted. She sat in the carriage with her hands in her lap and looked at the countryside passing outside the window, and did not speak for a long time. Then she said to Linnet, "Who is the solicitor?" "His name is Theophilus Marsden," Linnet said. Mary was quiet a moment. "Tell him," she said, and stopped and began again. "Tell him I would like to thank him when there is an occasion for it." "You can tell him yourself," Linnet said. "He will be at the dinner." Roderick's birthday dinner was held on a Friday evening in the second week of February at Halnaby House. The dining room lit with 40 candles and the table set for 20. The guests were the kind of people who attended such dinners, men of standing, their wives, 2 members of Parliament, a judge of the Common Pleas, and several individuals whose connection to Roderick was primarily financial. The footman announced each arrival. The room filled. The soup was brought. Augusta's place, at the far end of the table from Roderick, remained empty. Roderick sat at the head of the table and watched the door, and smiled, and spoke, and ate nothing. At 20 minutes past 8, the dining room doors opened. Augusta entered in dark blue silk, her hair dressed simply, her pace unhurried. She did not look at Roderick immediately. She looked at the room, at the 20 faces turning toward her, at the candles, at the table she had ordered laid for 23 years. Then she looked at her husband. Roderick rose. His face was the color of the white tablecloth. Behind Augusta, Lynette Vaughn entered the dining room. The room understood instantly, not the particulars, but the shape of the thing, and the shape was damning. A murmur moved through the guests and stopped. Behind Lynette, Theophilus Marsden entered carrying a leather folio, and the room went entirely silent. Augusta let the silence stand for a full 10 seconds. She had planned this moment with care, and she had planned to let the silence do its work before she spoke, because the silence was already saying something. That these 3 people had arrived together, prepared, and that nothing about what followed would be a surprise to any of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Augusta said, "I apologize for the interruption to your evening. I will not take long." She turned to Roderick. He had not sat back down. He stood at the head of the table with his hands at his sides. And for the first time in 23 years, Augusta looked at him without managing her expression at all. "My husband," she said, "has spent the better part of 2 years arranging to have me certified as a person of unsound mind and committed to a private establishment. He engaged Dr. Pell of Harley Street to provide the certificate, paying him in 3 installments over 6 months, the records of which are now in the possession of the court. The purpose was my separate trust of £18,000, which would have transferred to my husband's management upon my legal incapacity." She paused. "This is not a new scheme. 3 years ago in Bristol, a woman named Mary Holloway was committed to a Yorkshire asylum by the same doctor under identical circumstances, at the instigation of a business associate of my husband's. Mrs. Holloway was released by habeas action 4 days ago. She is in London tonight." The room had not moved. One of the parliamentary guests had set down his wine glass. The judge of the Common Pleas was watching Augusta with an expression of concentrated attention. Theophilus stepped forward and opened the leather folio. He placed 3 documents on the table, one at a time, in the deliberate sequence they had agreed upon, and spoke each document's identity as he set it down. "The criminal complaint filed this morning," he said, naming Sir Roderick Calthorpe, Mr. Gerald Holloway, and Dr. Edmund Pell, for conspiracy to defraud by fraudulent commitment. He set it down. The petition for separation, granted by the court on the 12th of February, uncontested. He set it down. The notice of suspension issued by the College of Physicians to Dr. Pell, pending inquiry into his conduct in the matters of Mrs. Augusta Calthorpe and Mrs. Mary Holloway. He set it down and stepped back. Roderick said, in a voice that was almost steady, "Augusta, you are—" "I am not unwell," Augusta said. "I am not disordered. I am not fragile. I am not any of the things you described to your doctor, or to your mistress, or to your aunt, or to anyone else you required to believe a particular story about my mind." She looked at the room, at the 20 faces, and her voice was clear and entirely calm. I did not come here this evening for an apology. I came so that no one in this room, no one who sits at this table tonight or speaks of this evening afterward, could ever say they did not know, could ever say they were not present, could ever say that what happened to me happened in the dark. She turned away from her husband's face and walked toward the doors. The room did not speak. Linnet fell into step beside her. At the doors, Augusta stopped once and looked back. Not at Roderick, but at the table, the candles, the 20 faces, the rooms she had managed for 23 years. And then she walked through the doors and did not look back again. Theophilus followed, the folio under his arm. Before she had left the house that evening, before the guests had arrived, before Roderick had come down to the dining room, Augusta had gone to the mantelpiece and placed 2 folded notes there, side by side, addressed in her own hand. They were brief, identical, written with the same pen and the same ink, and they said only, "Notice has been served." The footman found them an hour later, after the room had emptied and the candles had been snuffed, and Roderick had been arrested in the street 2 blocks from Dr. Pell's house, where he had been attempting to arrive before the night was finished. The footman held the 2 notes in the lamplight for a moment, then placed them on the salver and carried them to the butler, who did not know what to do with them. And so they remained on the salver in the hall of Halnaby House until morning, when the solicitor's clerk arrived to take possession of the house's documents, and took them as well. The morning after the dinner, Augusta arrived at the Gray's Inn chambers at 9 o'clock to find Theophilus already at the desk, but not working. He was sitting with a cup of tea and no papers in front of him, which was the first time she had seen him at that desk without papers in front of him. And it made the room look different. Larger, quieter, as though it had been cleared of something. The petition was granted. The criminal charge was filed. Linnet had departed the previous evening for Antwerp, where she had family and where Augusta had insisted, over Linnet's protests, on providing a settlement from the first disbursement of her trust. Enough to establish herself, enough to choose. Mary Holloway was in her cottage with her sister, and had sent through Theophilus's clerk a note that contained only 4 words. "I am outside now." "You are leaving for Bath today," Theophilus said. "This afternoon," Augusta confirmed. "I have taken a small house there under my maiden name. Mrs. Augusta Pierce." She paused. It seemed appropriate to begin with the name I had before. She sat down across from him for the last time in this configuration. The 2 of them at this desk, with work between them. There was no work between them now. The desk was clear. "What will you do?" she asked. "With the practice?" "Rebuild it," he said without particular distress. "I have had inquiries already. 3 women whose cases I declined 2 years ago because they were too costly to my standing. I wrote to them last week. They have all responded." He looked at his tea. "It turns out that being willing to do the thing that is actually required is a reasonable foundation for a practice." "And your daughter?" "Clara is well," he said. "Better than well. She has taken up residence with a friend and is studying medicine, which she apparently intended to do for some time and did not mention because she thought the engagement would make it impossible." He paused. "She is not wrong that it would have." Augusta looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light came through the windows of the chambers and lay across the clear desk between them. "I do not know yet what kind of woman I will be in 6 months, Augusta said. "I have spent 23 years being a particular kind of woman, and I am finished with that, and I do not yet know what is on the other side of it. She stood and picked up her gloves. But when I have had some months in Bath and have been Mrs. Augusta Pierce for long enough to understand what that means, I would like to write to you about it. Theophilus stood. I would like that, he said. Very much. She was at the door when she stopped. She stood for a moment with her hand on the frame, and then she turned and crossed the room back to him, not quickly, not with hesitation, but with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided. And she kissed him once, slowly, without urgency, with both her hands against his chest and his hands coming up to hold her arms. And it was not a declaration or a conclusion, but a beginning placed carefully on a shelf, to be taken down when both of them were ready. She stepped back. She looked at him once, directly, and saw that he was entirely present, not surprised, not managing his expression, simply there. Write to me when you have settled, she said. His answer was quiet and certain. I will, he said. She went out. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, steady and unhurried, and then the street door, and then silence. 8 months of letters followed. They began formally. Dear Mr. Marsden, dear Lady Halnaby, and became, over the course of the autumn, something else entirely. Dear Theophilus, dear Augusta. She wrote about the house in Bath, the garden she was learning to manage, the neighbor who had introduced herself as Mrs. Pierce's predecessor, and spent an afternoon telling her the history of every family on the street. He wrote about the practice, about Clara's first term at the medical college, about a case he had taken in September that involved a contested will and a woman of 72 who had more legal acuity than most of his colleagues and twice their nerve. He wrote, in October, about a jar of preserved lemons he had found at a market that tasted exactly right. She wrote back, in November, that she was glad. In late September, Theophilus came to Bath for 3 days. He remained 9. The small drawing room of the house in the evenings, the fire lit, Augusta reading aloud from a novel she had recommended in one of her letters, while Theophilus sat in the chair opposite and listened with the same whole attention he had given everything she had ever said to him. On the 6th evening she closed the book at the end of a chapter and set it on the table beside her, and looked at him across the room, and he looked back at her. And then he rose and crossed to where she was sitting, and she took his hand, and he extinguished the lamp. The next image is morning. Late summer light through open windows, the smell of the Bath garden coming in, 2 teacups on a single tray on the low table. On the writing desk in the corner, a half-finished letter in Augusta's hand, the ink still fresh, addressed to a cottage outside London. It began, My dear Mary, you will be glad to hear. The 2 notes of the title, transformed. No longer a husband's instruction, whispered to a woman he had used, carried in secret across a city to the wife he intended to erase. These are a woman's own words, written in her own house, under her own name, in the full light of a morning she had chosen, to a friend she had found in the ruins of a man's deception and kept for her own. Notice had been served. The rest was hers.